Hello, everyone, and welcome to Blogging Theology. And today I'm delighted to be joined by Ustadh Ibrahim and Dr. Abu Haq Baker. You're most welcome, gentlemen. Salam alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam. Thank you.
It's very kind of you to come along at such short notice to talk about extremely important subject. And this podcast is going to be a simple guide to what is happening in Sudan, inshallah. And there is a perception, I think, that many people have that Sudan's conflict is the forgotten war of the world. And today we just want to scratch the surface, bring some expertise, some first-hand experience to us all, that we may benefit from your knowledge and experience. And just want to introduce you both briefly. Ustadh Ibrahim is the founder and chief lecturer at historian.com. The first and largest private app dedicated to Islamic history. He also hosts the Historian YouTube channel, which has got nearly 200k subscribers, producing documentaries and lectures since 2012. He has lectured at UK universities and advises organizations worldwide on Muslim history curricula. And his mission is to reconnect Muslims with their history through critical and meaningful study. Dr. Abdul Haq Baker is founder and managing director of Street UK, an award-winning youth initiative. He is a former lecturer in terrorism studies at the University of St Andrews and research fellow at the University of Exeter's European Muslim Research Centre. And he chaired Brixton Mosque from 1994 to 2009. He's the author of Extremists in Our Midst, Confronting Terror. And Dr. Baker is a leading authority on youth intervention and community engagement. As head of Strap UK consultancy, he pioneers work in decolonizing health research. And his website, I'll put the links in the description below, www.abdulhaqbaker.com. So as I was saying in the introduction, this podcast, inshallah, will be a simple guide to what's happening in Sudan. And I'm going to start with a really, really basic question. And forgive me if like most of you already know the answer to this, but where is Sudan?
Brother Ibrahim, do you want to start on that?
Bismillah wa salatu wassalam ala Sayyidina Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Thank you for the invitation. It's a wonderful opportunity. Well, it's a good question, actually. It's not as simple as you may think it is. Even those who perhaps are Sudanese may be actually confused by that question. The Sudan is what we know today as the Arab Republic of Sudan. It's the region is north of Ethiopia, and it's just below Egypt. Right? But in history, in antiquity, it was a larger region. And there were various empires at that time that were known as the Sudanic empires. And this was stretched from West Africa, where I'm from, Senegal, all the way across to East Africa.
Wow.
So, for example, the Songhai Empire was part of the Sudanic empires. We talk of the Mali Empire, Sudanic empires. And there were many other. Ghana Empire, the mighty Ghana Empire, is part of the Sudanic empires. If you move on to the eastern flank of Africa, you then have the Nubian Empire. You have Kush. These are wonderful empires. At their peak would be competing against the Egyptian Empire. And in fact, many historians say that the Egyptians are originally from Sudan. There are more pyramids in Sudan to this day than there are in Egypt. So these were you could say, the predecessors of the Egyptian Empire and civilization. So the Sudan, in antiquity, it actually literally meant, the Arab scholars, they had a term known as Bilad al-Sudan. Bilad, the lands, al-Sudan, of the blacks. It was a generic term for anything below the Sahelian belt. Right. So when you go down from Egypt, beyond a certain point, what we today call sub-Saharan Africa is a catch-all, basically, everything below that region, sub-Saharan Africa. The Arab scholars would call it Bilad al-Sudan, the lands, that's everything below, of the blacks, everything below. Sudan actually means black.
I didn't know that.
It actually means black.
And what language would that be? What languages?
They had Nubian at the time. There was the kingdom of Meroe. There were kingdoms before Islam even arrived on the peninsula of Africa that precede the Bible itself. These were ancient civilizations that the Greeks and the Romans and the Egyptians knew about, and they were known for wisdom. The Quran itself, by the way, there's a chapter in the Quran that is named after a very famous Sudanese man. His name was Luqman. Luqman came from Sudan. And it is said, if you look at the books of Mufassirun, Luqman, his wisdom was such that even the King David recruited him to be a judge in his courts. And the young Sulaiman alayhi salam was his protege, like his understudy. Right? And the wisdom of Luqman, even in the Quran, we can see. So it's a wonderful question, because there is a lot more to what we think it is. Sudan today is a specific region, and even within that region, it's actually the third largest when it comes to population. In the Arab Muslim world, the third largest, most significant country is the Sudan. The second largest by land mass is the Sudan. It's a very significant land. So the Sudan could mean many things. If we say the Sudan today, we mean that specific republic. When we say Sudan, we mean everything from east to west below the Nile is the Sudan. So there's a lot of history there.
Extraordinary.
Paul, may I add tangentially to the wealth of information that Ibrahim has just summarized? Why is there such ignorance regarding the Sudan? Why is there such ignorance surrounding Africa? And I'd like to proffer that this comes from the fact that many of us still view Africa, the darker continent, through a colonial lens. And this is an unfortunate aspect, even with regards to categorization of the Sudan, when we see what has transpired recently with Gaza, with other conflicts. And the Sudan is secondary, if not tertiary, in consideration, because it's not considered with equal worth because of the continent within which it is located. And again, all of this comes from a post-colonial, if you like, imperialist mindset, which even some of us within the faith are viewing it.
Indeed.
I should also add one thing actually to this. Believe it or not, when we talk of Bilad, when we talk of, for example, Darul Harb and Darul Islam, this conflict of civilizations, and in the olden days, this was Christendom and Islam, the world of Christendom and the world of Islam. But there was also a third region. There was a third region that was in Sudan. The Sudan was the third region. And this was the region where there was neither Islam nor Christianity. There was neither war, there was no hostility, but there was some sort of treaty in that region. And this was signed in the year 652, what was known as a Bact Treaty. It's a very historical, actually, it's something that we should all know about. Because the Muslims signed that treaty in 652 in Egypt, and it lasted 700 years. And in that 700 years, there was no war, there was no inquisition. The Muslims never raided Sudan because the Prophet prohibited it, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And the companions from very early on, they signed a peace treaty that lasted 700 years. The Prophet said,
al-As, yes.
His son was the one who signed the treaty, the Bact Treaty, with the Christian king.
Can I just clarify? You said 700 years. Did you
700 years, yes.
Oh, this is remarkable. I had actually heard of this before, and I completely forgotten about it. So this is remarkable. So that region, that land, that country, that people were respected, and there was for 700 years. Even though Sudan is quite close to the Arabian Peninsula across the Red Sea, I guess. So that is remarkable. A remarkable statistic.
There were treaties, and there was engagement prior to Islam. Yes. And as Ibrahim's mentioned, the kingdom of Kush, which was also known as Nubia, used to be in alliances with Egypt. And even at a point, this kingdom, Kushite kingdom, conquered Egypt. So we have this historically. Amr bin al-As was the one who pushed at the borders when he conquered Egypt in that regard. But as Ibrahim has highlighted, this treaty, one of the longest ever, was signed and upheld for this period of time.
May I add one more thing? Because there is, historically speaking, there's the notion that Islam entered Africa through slavery, and that the Arabs raided African villages and enslaved these people and Arabized them. It couldn't be farther from the truth. The Nubians, the Kushites, were known to be fierce warriors. In the Seerah itself, the man who kills Sayyidina Hamza, was Wahshi. Wahshi was known for his spear throwing. And these people were known as master spear throwers. They were known as master spear throwers and very vicious. The Sahaba tried to conquer them. And they took the Sahaba out. Right? The Sahaba who tried to conquer them, they were taken out. This peace treaty was because it was beneficial for both parties. They tried to conquer, but they couldn't conquer, so they came to peace terms. But prior to that, the Prophet did say, leave the people of Abyssinia alone. Do not attack the Abyssinians. That was a pronouncement made by Rasulullah and that lasted 700 years. Now, in that space of time, there was Islamicization. There were traders, there were peaceful convoys, and there were also diplomatic missions between the two regions, Egypt and also the coast, and Sudan, and then below that. So they were a mighty people. Make no mistake, this wasn't a charitable act that the Arabs or the Muslims decided to leave them alone. It was in their interest as well to leave them alone. You know, just a bit of history here. Recently, I saw an interview that went quite viral between Candace Owens.
Oh yes.
And I forget the name of the other chap, an American guy. Very, very anti-Islam, Nick Fuentes. That's the man.
Right. Okay.
And he challenges Candace Owens. He says to her, tell me of an African nation, without mentioning Egypt, that had two-story buildings prior to colonization. And this is a trope that many racists always mention when it concerns Africa. If you take Egypt out of the equation, you have nothing else. So he says to her, tell me of any African nation prior to colonization, without mentioning Egypt, that had two-story buildings. Candace Owens was unable to speak. And here's the irony of it all. Her name, Candace, was literally the title of the Sudanese empresses. You know how we have Caesar, how we have Khosrow, right? You have a Candace is a title of the queens in Nubia. And so her name comes from the names of the queens in Nubia. And there was a specific Candace in the 1st century BC, Amaniranas. Her name was Candace Amaniranas. She defeated the Roman legions. This is known. Augustus at the time was in power, and she defaced his statue. They had to come on peaceful terms with these people because he couldn't defeat them. They were indomitable. So the Muslims, when they came in the 7th century, the same thing happened. They had to sign treaties. So in the 6th century, 7th century, 652. So the point being, there is a lot missing here in terms of context, contextualization. The people of Sudan, if you look at the books of Tariq, our books of history, there are replete evidences and many, many, many stories of people coming from Sudan or that region known as Bilad Sudan, who had mastered many of the sciences in Islamic studies and history. So it is important that we do actually educate the community about the Sudan. It's unfortunate that we are so really oblivious to really what's in that region. And also just politically speaking and geographically speaking, it's a very large country. It's not a small country.
No, it's huge.
It's a huge country.
If you look on the map along Africa, in that northeast, you can see it's a vast country, absolutely massive.
It's massive, and also for the Arabic-speaking world, it's one of the largest populated nations. The 2nd largest, in fact, after Egypt. So it has a very, very central position. And the history, we can go on forever, but the Sudan means a lot of things. Yes. But in the context today, it means that nation between Ethiopia and Egypt.
Well, it's an excellent lesson. I'm glad I asked that very apparently basic question. It obviously elicited such a rich and interesting response. And I've learned, actually, I didn't realize that the Sudan has 2 official languages. One of them is Arabic, not surprisingly, and the other is English. And this again speaks to another aspect of the more recent colonial past when the English occupied that country.
They were very educated in that language as well, Paul. For example, if I speak from the experiences I've had with the Sudanese living in Saudi Arabia, they occupy positions of professorship around the country and the globe, as it were, in that particular aspect. And the command of the English language and the eloquence with which they speak is on a par with the Arabic mother tongue that they use as well. So when we're speaking about the English language, yes, it's the language of the colonizers at that particular time, but they've mastered that and have an ownership of it, which is, if you look across the African continent in that instance, without much of nuances of accents as well. I'm not sure if you've met any Sudanese professors and scholars, and as I will allude to when we speak about my visit to Sudan, when I went to one of the camps and one of the professors came very dignified to meet and greet me and my colleagues, I actually thought he was part of the relief team. It was only when he explained to me, no, I'm here, I've been displaced, I'm internally displaced. Wow. And he explained that to me that I realized that he was fleeing from the village that he had come from. But I thought he was from another British relief team that was just there in the camp at the same time as we were. Such was the eloquence, such was the education of the ordinary Sudanese that we met.
May I add one thing just quickly here? It's a good thing you mentioned about the Arab world. Malcolm X.
Yes.
People don't realize Malcolm's, you could say, he traveled to Sudan twice, at least twice.
Well, why did he travel? Because he was an American. Why did he travel to Sudan particularly?
Very good. So in 1959, the Nation of Islam had sent him on a world tour. Right. And part of his mission was to go before Elijah Muhammad would arrive. So he would go to these nations and pronounce that Elijah Muhammad is coming to make Hajj, to make good press and relations. So he went before his teacher went, essentially.
Yeah.
He had gone to Saudi Arabia. So the Hajj in 64 wasn't the first time. He already had gone before. And by the way, he could have made Hajj. They offered him the opportunity, but he said, not before my master makes Hajj. Yeah. When he went to Ethiopia, when he went to Sudan, he went with a camera. You will find pictures of Malcolm X with a camera, a camcorder. He went specifically with the purpose of recording the historical sites and the heritage of Sudan, which he had intended to go back to America and to teach his people about. Wow. This was his final wish, but he never got to realize that wish. When he was in Sudan, he met a number of future professors. One of them, he became a mountain when it comes to the science of Islamic psychology, Dr. Malik Badri. Dr. Malik Badri, I'm sure you probably have heard of his name before. He's a very, very influential. He's passed away a couple of years ago now. And he was the young man who met Malcolm in 59. And he planted seeds of Tawheed in his mind. I did a whole documentary on this. Malik Badri was a Sudanese. Malcolm would then meet two further Sudanese students who came to the US to study in 1962. And they would further push him towards Sunni Islam. This is before the whole fiasco with the NOI. They were challenging him intellectually. They were intellectual people.
Right.
Very intellectual people. When he goes to Hajj in 64, he meets the first finance minister in Saudi Arabia. And he was a Sudanese man.
That's right.
Surur Sabban. And this man, Malcolm writes in his own diary, was the most impressive human being he had ever met. The most impressive human being intellectually, but also his character he had ever met. And he spoke of him as the true king of the Hijaz. Finally, Surur Sabban, who was the Minister of Finance, the first minister, he was a black man. You see his pictures, a black man, not an Arab. He was a black man. But the Saudis put him in that position of prominence. He was also the first chairman of the Muslim World League. So Malcolm came under his, you could say, entourage, and he set him up with another Sudanese man who had been in Saudi for 30 years, teaching in the masjid of in Masjid al-Haram in Mecca. 30 years. This was Ahmed Hassoun, Sheikh Ahmed Hassoun. He spoke Arabic and English. That's why I'm mentioning it. His Arabic was, of course, perfect. His English was also very good. So Malcolm went from one Sudanese to another Sudanese, and this sheikh was the one who accompanied him for the rest of his life, 6 months.
Right.
So all of the ideas, when you see Malcolm say, for example, I'm no longer a black nationalist, I'm no longer a racist, I judge by character. When you hear Malcolm say Christians and Jews, we can come together on common purpose, all of those talking points came directly from the Sudanese teacher.
Right.
All of those talking points. And his Sudanese companions, who until he died, were the only people who stuck by him. So they are a special people. They are a special people in history.
Okay. Well, maybe we could move to the next question, really, is bring up to date. Why is there a civil war in Sudan?
Dr. Baker?
I'll proffer you from you know what, Paul, there are different theories that are going around at the moment, and I'm going to speak to the one that's most prevalent and prominent at the moment. I'm going to let Ibrahim go into the details between the factions that are fighting at this particular moment in time, but the most obvious and the one that is getting a lot of notice is because of the reserves and the wealth that is there in Sudan and the extrapolation of that wealth.
The gold,
and other other minerals and resources there, but primarily the gold. And what we are seeing, and evidence has pointed to that there's a proxy war that is taking place with other entities, nation states, external, funding RSF in that instance, and other factions funding the government forces. But that's one of the aspects, and one of the main focuses is that proxy war based on the raw materials that are actually there. Now, that's quite a simplistic response, and some will say it's more than that. As I said, there's history there. There are layers to beneath this, but the things that are driving it from outside is this particular focus on resources at the moment. Gold as a resource.
You mentioned
Ibrahim,
the RSF fighters. Who are the RSF fighters?
Ibrahim, do you want to talk about the history of them and the government forces?
Yeah, I mean, I think at the moment there is a new focus on Sudan, which we are happy that people are finally speaking about Sudan. You know, we spoke about this, Doctor and I spoke about a month and a bit ago, when it was in the shadow. And it was actually, to even mention Sudan was considered to be seditious. People didn't want to hear Sudan aligned with Gaza. Now it's come to the forefront, and it's a good thing. There's a lot of background context to this, right? The Sudan is one of the most unstable nations in the world, and it has been for a long time, about 70 years. It became independent from Britain in 56, and also from Egypt. Ever since then, and I delivered a course last year called Shadow History, in which we looked at every single Muslim nation for 100 years, from the fall of the Ottoman Empire up until the dawn of the 20th century. What happened? 21st century, sorry, what happened? Among part of that analysis was going through every single coup d'etat, every revolution, every civil war in every single Muslim nation. The two nations that were the most prone to civil wars were Yemen and Sudan. The Sudan takes the prize in that competition, unfortunately. So the issue of military coup d'etat, civil wars, has been a continual, perpetual thing in Sudan. It's unfortunate that's been the case. In most recent terms, however, our story begins in 2003.
Right.
Those of us who are old enough to be cognizant of that fact, there was a Darfur situation in 2003. And that was a racial, tribal, regional tension, and also a massacre of epic proportions. And that is what brought that issue to the international world at the time. There was talk of slavery, there was talk of genocide, there was talk of mass violation. And this was between the Arabs and the black Sudanese. Okay, that's a lot, and there's a lot to unpack here, because they're all black. The land is called the land of the blacks, they're all black. But there is a tension, a political, a racial, a tribal tension in the Sudan that makes it a very unstable nation. So from 2003, we had that really very terrible civil war in Darfur, and many people died and perished. Then in 2011, we had the split of Sudan. The Sudan was split into two portions. Northern Sudan, which is Arab and Muslim, and Southern Sudan, which is Christian, and you could say Bantu, black. So the Sudan was split in 2011. Recently, there's been a third revolution, or coup d'etat, where the population, the general mass, the students, the working classes, because of an economic crisis, have decided to basically call for a revolution. And we have seen this through the media being celebrated as a call to, for example, modernization, the Arab Spring come late. It was celebrated also for women's rights. It was celebrated as everything but what it truly was. So when the students and the people came to demand that the leader of the time, which was Omar al-Bashir, who's been in power for 30 years, they demanded that he be removed from position. That did happen. But what happened as a result of that was there were two commanders within his army, within his military establishment, that told the masses, don't worry, he's been taken away. And in between us and the new government, we will have a transitionary government that we will look after. So that lasted about 2 years. And 2 years later, what happens? The military comes and effectively takes over the revolution. They took the revolution over. And these two factions, one of them being the RSF, and the other being the SAF, the Sudanese Armed Forces, the official army, went against one another. So that's why we find in 2023, these two factions have basically split the country apart once again. But I should mention, As I mentioned earlier on, Darfur in 2003 was the beginning of the current story. You need to go back to 2003. In 2003, Omar al-Bashir, who was the president, had problems with certain tribes within the region of Darfur. And Darfur is in the eastern flank, so the western flank of what is now northern Sudan. There were tribal, you could say, conflicts, many of them racially based, okay? And he decided to take sides with the Arab tribes and the Arab militias, and he sent them to cleanse those regions. That was a terrific crime against humanity, but it was tolerated because it's Sudan after all, they're all black, it doesn't matter. That unit was known as the Janjaweed. I'm sure you've heard of the Janjaweed, which means the jinn on horses, right? The Janjaweed. So the Janjaweed, following that Darfur situation, was rebranded and repackaged. So al-Bashir rebranded them and he called them the Rapid Support Forces, RSF. So that's how they were institutionalized, they were sanitized, and they were brought in to just be another reserve for the main army, the SAF, the Sudanese Armed Forces. Now the RSF, before the current war we're seeing today, was being sent to other Muslim nations to wreak havoc, most notably in Yemen. The RSF was sent to Yemen with UAE support and Saudi support to commit crimes against humanity in Yemen. So it's not their first rodeo. They've done this before in 2003. They've done it again in Yemen and in other regions. Some say, I think, also Libya. They were a mercenary unit that Bashir used to basically put down rebellions or to snuff out anyone he didn't like. The difference is now in 2023, Bashir was taken out. They left to their own devices. And now these two units, the army and this reservist army, are going at it for the country. So it's a literal hellhole. So it's a Janjaweed 2.0, basically.
It sounds absolutely awful, but what has been done to end the conflict? I mean, also, has it helped that the world's apparently taken its eye off Palestine? I mean, not completely, but, the genocide there may have come to a pause. Has that helped the situation in Sudan now as well? And what steps have been done to end the conflict in Sudan now?
It's helped somewhat. Of course, it's helped somewhat, but the appetite for Sudan doesn't appear to be the same as it was for Gaza. And some will say, well, that's obvious, and we want to know why, because the population of Sudan is far larger than what we have with the Palestinians. The number of deaths, the bloodletting is on a scale that is far larger than what we've witnessed in Gaza, in Palestine, occupied Palestine. And we're not trying to diminish the latter, but we're trying to bring to the fore that this has been largely ignored. And one of the reasons that you hear is that this is a civil war, and it's internal, and it's between people of the same ethnicity, and so therefore it's not on the scale of an outside occupier coming and perpetrating the same atrocities we've seen in Gaza, in Palestine for the past 75 years. And so there is some validity to the internal aspect, the allegations that it's an internal conflict that's taking place. But what we need to look at is that this is being done on a geopolitical scale and is a proxy war for others. Right. So that's why the attention is really, really important, not just because eyes are off Gaza at the moment, but they should always be on the Sudan, based on the timeline that Ibrahim has given from 2003, the massacres that took place then and that are continuing to take place now.
So there's a lot of myopia I want to add again, because there's a myopic view, a purview of what's happening in Sudan, why Sudan matters. Sudan has always been, as I've alluded to in the earlier introduction, it's a significant state. It's not a small slither of a land somewhere in the Middle East. It is part of the Middle East, actually. In fact, the Middle East, as we know it, 75% is in Africa. The Middle East, 75% of the Middle East in terms of land mass is literally in Africa. And the Sudan is the second largest in that region when it comes to land mass. The Sudan, by the way, during the apartheid in South Africa, were anti-apartheid, were anti-Israel, and they've maintained that stance until recently. It's only recently this anti-Israel chokehold has been effectively loosened. They've always been a thorn on the side of the imperial, or you could say Zionist agenda. They've always been. It's only now that they've been weakened that the threat of Sudan is being alleviated. The Sudan also recently, the SAF, the Sudanese Armed Forces, released a report, a centennial report, because Sudan celebrates 100 years next year, January 1st, 2026. So 70 years. They released a report, a 100-year report, because their history goes beyond just the independence. For 100 years, they've been training militias beyond Sudan. So, for example, many of the Palestinian resistance forces, believe it or not, were trained in Sudan.
Wow.
They were trained in Sudan.
Mm-hmm.
Many figures, I don't want to mention names here, maybe it's not the right place to mention names. Many very, very prominent political figures in the Muslim world sought shelter in Sudan in the 90s. So Sudan has continually been a very, very strategic and pivotal region. Politically speaking, one of the main thorns on the side of the imperial American, but also Zionist entity. When Nelson Mandela in '62 left South Africa, he went to Sudan and they gave him a passport to endorse the ANC. When Patrice Lumumba was killed, the Sudanese students took to the streets in protest. These were people who were always anti-colonialism, and I believe personally the Sudan would have been, had it been stable, one of the most powerful allies of the Palestinian cause, one of the most powerful allies of the Palestinians, would have been the most powerful. But because it's unstable and it's not in a position anymore to exercise power and influence, Palestine suffers anyway. Mm-hmm. It suffers greater if Sudan suffers. And these are things that I think we're not connecting those dots. When we talk of Palestine or Sudan, it should be Palestine and Sudan, because the equation crosses between those borders. Both of them are correlated. We should care equally for both of them.
Racism plays a part as well, Paul, when we look at the position. You might say, well, we've alluded to that. If you were to see some of the footage, I shared some with Ibrahim from some of the Arab lands, and we're not putting a swathe, casting a swathe brush across there, all Arabs and everything, of course not. But when you're hearing the likening of Sudanese who are being subjected to RSF massacres to animals, when you're seeing laughter and mimicking the suffering of the Sudanese in that regard, that racism is something, again, it's broader than just region that we're looking at. Anti-Black racism is rife in this context as well. And that can be via neglect, or it can be, as I've just highlighted, mocking and denigrating. And these are things that are going to continue to surface. But the litmus test now is the Sudan.
Mm-hmm. The question I have, is there a genocide in Sudan?
Without doubt. There's
Yes,
a genocide.
Absolutely.
There's an ethnocide. And any other side you want to add to it, there is that times 10. Mm-hmm. It's actually the worst humanitarian crisis in modern history. Point blank. There's no second. This is the worst, according to all the official reports, the worst genocide. There are at least 10 million people right now who are starving, and a large portion of them stage 5 starvation. Stage 5 starvation is basically, even if you do eat today, you're still going to suffer long-term consequences because of what your body has had to endure. Okay, not to mention the violations, the mass violations of women. I don't want to get into the graphic details here. Not to mention the horrific violence that's being recorded now. You know, they're taking selfies while they're doing this. They're so brazen.
Pause a moment, Ibrahim. Without going into details, and sorry to interject, my brother, we won't go into the details, but when you have groups of women en masse, 100 women committing suicide to avoid being raped, this is documented. The bloodletting, as I've alluded to earlier on, and was it New York Times and some other Western outlets referring to satellite imagery of the extent of the massacring, the genocidal actions of the RSF. seeing satellite images of blood spewed across acres of land and bodies lying there. For anyone to deny that it's a genocide, you have to question what is their political reason or rationale, or ideological in that case, for denying such an obvious crime.
And then there's actually on the BBC News website, there's actually footage brazenly taken of what the BBC called an RSF fighter executioner, and they didn't actually show the executions, although they were on the film. They showed the unarmed men and women who were about to be executed, slaughtered in cold blood. I mean, this is a war crime, obviously. And the guy has got his own TikTok account, apparently. I mean, and you know, he's got a TikTok account. You couldn't make this up, you know. And he's just going around executing people, i.e., slaughtering people in cold blood. So it's not in battle or anything. It's not self-defense. This is people sitting down. He's just shooting them all. And that you can see it on BBC News. This was like several days ago.
And the condemnation is not on the scale that we see in other conflicts. Why is it? And we've got to look at this as well, because this is a religio-political point that I'm going to make here now. If we harken back to the Balkans conflict, and we saw similar celebrations of massacres of Muslims, okay, that was closer to us in proximity with geographically, and some were involved in that. It wasn't considered terrorism or extremism to go and support the suffering Bosnians at that particular time. So many of us, like I went into Sudan last year, I traveled on occasion to Zagreb when the Balkans conflict was on, and what we witnessed, which Western media, Western governments were witnessing but not commenting on, was a travesty. And we're witnessing that today, more so because we now have social media to highlight, to document these particular crimes. And I say religio-political in this particular on this particular occasion, is because the victims of this are always Muslim. The Balkans, Gaza, Sudan. And we have another conflict taking place at this moment now, but we see the focus there when we see the suffering of individuals, even if it's one or two of them, Ukraine. And there's such a disparity that's there that we have to question what is the impetus behind those who are ignoring these atrocities, and those conversely who are fueling it.
Yeah, obviously, you mentioned Ukraine there, the difference in the way the innocent victims, the population in Ukraine have been treated, you know, welcomed here as refugees and so on, and compare that with the Palestinians and the Sudanese and so on. The reason I think is fairly obvious. Yeah. I want to ask, I asked before really, but what is being done to end the conflict? Is this just going to like grind on indefinitely, or are there, you know, serious attempts to stop it?
Ibrahim, your position.
Realize that the Sudan is a business case right now. The price of gold has actually just is soaring. I don't think it's been this high for a long time, because the Sudan is one of the largest exporters of gold, right? Also oil, huge oil reserves, mostly in the south. The Sudan is also a very fertile land. There are 12 rivers that flow in the Sudan, okay? The Nile also. So everything about the Sudan is gold, but the gold itself is something that's currently being exported to the UAE and other regions, but mostly UAE. The UAE has no mines. They don't have any gold. So where's the gold coming from? It's coming from the Sudan. And so it is lucrative, it's profitable for the Sudan to remain the way it is today. There are no serious attempts to stop. There were some gestures in the media in the last 2 weeks because of what's happening now. Certain nations gave a few $100 million, which is minuscule compared to what's been extracted over the last 2 years. It's nothing. What is if I steal your entire bank account and give you £5 afterwards? A donation of £5 means nothing. There are no serious attempts right now to do anything about the Sudan, because it's considered an internal affair. It's between two warring generals within the same administration, you could say, legacy administration, and it's the same people. So it doesn't appear to be something that concerns a wider world, but in reality, there are many external interests who are actually manipulating the situation in Sudan. You have Russia, you have China, you have the UAE, you have Saudi Arabia, you have Egypt, and others. They're all involved. We have Colombian mercenaries in the Sudan, training children to kill, right? So it's like an open treasury that every bandit is coming to seek their opportunity. There's no incentive to
add to what Ibrahim's saying, if I may. When I haven't spoken about this publicly before, when I was in Sudan last year, I went on a relief effort. I was CEO of the Green Lane Mosque, and they have a task force, GLM, and we went with Islamic Relief. And when we were going, we had to do checks and due diligence, and we knew we were going into a very dangerous situation that was very volatile. And when the hotel that we got to, I remember waking in the first morning and coming out, and it became a pattern those few days I was there. This is to speak to what Ibrahim's saying about other external interests. And there was one European individual there who I surmised was Russian after the few mornings that I kept meeting him. And he would be sitting by the lift, smoking heavily, not doing much more. And looking at his demeanor, looking at his stature and everything, I could only conclude that this was a mercenary. And you might say, well, how? He wasn't a politician. He wasn't anything else like that. He wasn't married into a family there. He was there on his own. And that wasn't just the one optics that was out of place. In other areas that we moved in, and it was almost, you'd see one or two white individuals. I saw two white children actually within minutes of each other in an area that was only Sudanese. They looked very comfortable there, teenage, 12, 13, about 15 at most. But when we went out one evening, and the atmosphere at night, the indigenous Sudanese were trying to have a semblance of normality, if you could call it that, with what's going on. A heavy SAF presence, very young soldiers. You had to have eye contact with them because I wanted to make sure that you were with them in the sense of solidarity and not acting suspiciously or whatever. Very young individuals. And I remember looking in the eye, giving a nod of acknowledgement, then they would put a thumbs up or wave, and then they would move on in their vehicles and their heavy ammunition and machinery that they were carrying. But on one occasion, we were in a particular area, which was near a military base. As we left that military base, we were strolling, one of my colleagues said, "What looks unusual here, Abdul?" And I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Look over there." We saw a white European individual, casual clothes on, acting as though his pickup truck had broken down and he had an individual fixing it. But what we saw from his behavior is that he was moving very slowly behind the vehicle to make sure that he was observing our movements, our direction of travel, where we were strolling to. And at one point I made it very obvious and stopped and looked at him. And I thought, who is he? What is he doing here? What is the presence of this individual and why? Just like the Russian individual that was in the hotel. And you saw this. It's almost like, I don't know if anyone has seen The Matrix from years ago, and the red dressed woman that was put into the system, and everyone else was dressed in grey, and she was an anomaly. These individuals were anomalies in Sudan. The behavior that we were watching around the airport was very suspicious. But we were told, do not inquire, do not stare. You need to just get to your destination and do not ask questions. And our trip was cut short because the circumstances had changed. We were informed that one of the guards was getting very, very nervous about our ID and wouldn't let us move from the particular city we were in at the time. Only one of us was allowed out of that city to visit another refugee camp, if you like. And so he stayed because they already had offices on the ground, internally displaced members, of course. But we had to go because it became unsafe and it wasn't conducive to us being in that environment for very much longer if we were not going to be visiting other camps, which were too dangerous to go to at that stage. So the point I'm making here is the tentacles that are in there, Paul, are external, and they must be supporting particular forces on the ground, whether it's SAF or RSF. And the question has to be asked, why? And it comes back to your question, is anything being done to resolve this? Well, we don't hear anything from the Western powers.
Well, that's what
like we hear with other conflicts.
I'll ask about the Americans. So has Trump said anything in the State Department? Have there been any statements of policy, intent, or have they sided with one side or the other? Or well, what's the
I have no knowledge or information of that. I've not heard
the Arab states
anything of that.
The Arab states are gesticulating. The UAE actually is one of those that's actually playing pantomime as a peacekeeper or as a peace broker in the region. So it said they've donated 100 million or 160 million recently to Sudan. But again, that's just a minor tip compared to what they've extracted and continue to extract today. Prior to the focus on Sudan, actually the Sudanese government took the UAE to court. And that appeal was kicked out of court in favor of the UAE. So it's quite strange that today the UAE wants to come and voluntarily pretend to be peacekeepers. It's bad PR because there are people calling for the boycott of the UAE. Mm-hmm. There are people calling for the UAE to be put in the same position that the IDF was put in when it came to Gaza. So it's bad. It's just PR. It's PR. But there are no serious, you could say, attempts to bring long-lasting peace. And of course, the investment put into the RSF has to pay off. After all, it's still a battle for the nation. It's either RSF or SAF, sorry. So before there is any sort of peace, there has to be at least some sort of, you could say, return on investments. So at the moment, there are no serious considerations. There are no serious movements, or you could say commitments to bring in peace in Sudan. We'll have to just wait and see what happens in the next 3 to 4 months. I do believe, however, the more we focus on those behind the scenes, the UAE is number one when it comes to the actors of malevolent intent towards the Sudanese. The more they're under the spotlight, the more pressure there will be to make a difference. They'll be under pressure to make a difference. Because prior to this, as I said before, it was taken to court and the UAE got it kicked out of court. It's only when we focus on Sudan today that they tried to make efforts to show goodwill by donating money and talking of potentially mediating.
I mean, what I understand is that countries like Egypt, who basically, Sudan shares a border in the north with Egypt, it's got the largest army, in the Arab world, Egypt. I mean, what are they doing? I mean, you say there are interests. What is Egypt's interest to do with Sudan specifically? And why, what's going on there?
The Nile. If you look at the whole East Africa, if you talk of, for example, Sudan, Eritrea, particularly Ethiopia, the waters that flow into Egypt, or the water that Egypt controls, is a huge, you could say, stake in the region, and the land that's being sold to Middle Eastern nations. Okay, so there's a lot. Egypt supports the SAF, the official army, so they're behind the SAF, right. And of course the borders have to be preserved. So if the SAF can secure the country, it's in the interest of Egypt because it helps the borders, but also the water and everything that comes with it. But for those who are backing the RSF, if they do get power, it's a new order, and those who bankrolled them will have a great, you could say, stakehold in the new nation. So it's not something that will just be dealt away with because people want peace. We're talking about return on investment here, and a lot has been invested. So for want of a better word, it's too lucrative a deal to just be given up just so easily. There has to be a lot more at stake. There has to be a lot more intervention and international outcry for it to even make sense to just stop. That's just a reality. That's the frank reality. There are a lot of people making a lot of money, and it's something that has to be acknowledged. Sudan is lucrative. It's as simple as that.
So, I mean, what's the Muslim Ummah? I don't mean the states necessarily, but the people, the Muslims in the world, to make of this? Well, when it comes to the war on Gaza, we're very clear what we support. We support the oppressed, those who are being dispossessed and ethnically cleansed and genocided in Palestine. Absolutely clear to anyone who dissented from that. But it's not clear to me, at least, what we should be doing vis-a-vis Sudan. At all. we're just looking and trying to understand and thinking, well, this is dreadful, and that's it. We're kind of mute after that, and that doesn't seem very satisfactory at all.
Can I ask you a question? Can I ask you a question? Sorry, can I just interject here?
Go ahead.
The Ummah, I'm addressing the Ummah. You people who are watching and listening, and who pride yourselves in your numbers. We are 2 billion. We're the fastest growing religion. Right? We will enter every home. We are the Ummah. The Ummah, Allah says in the Quran, إِنَّمَا الْمُؤْمِنُونَ إِخْوَةً. The believers are what? What are the believers? Brothers. How does that verse continue? It doesn't end there, because we only captured that part of the verse. إِنَّمَا الْمُؤْمِنُونَ إِخْوَةً. How does the verse continue? فَأَصْلِحُوا بَيْنَ أَخْوَيْكُمْ. Bring reconciliation between your brothers. It doesn't just end with we are one Ummah. Allah says, then therefore, reconcile between brothers. You know, the Quran mentions Surah Hujurat, when there are two believing factions fighting one another, it is incumbent as a duty for you, this Ummah, to reconcile. And if one of those two parties does not want to relinquish or does not want to come to peace, you have to side with the party that does want to come to peace. So our primary role as an Ummah is not to look for external enemies. We first begin in the house. You fix your house before you go out and try to fix another house. I'm not saying that we shouldn't focus on Gaza, but this dynamic of, because it is Israel against Muslims, we know what to do there. But because it's Muslim versus Muslim, we don't know what to do there. The Quran actually rebukes that. You should know exactly what to do.
Right.
Because you're an Ummah, and Allah has commanded that when there are Muslims fighting each other, you come together and you fix it. Because what happens? Through history, our greatest defeats have not been from external factions. In fact, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam was told, your Ummah will not be destroyed by any external faction. It will only be weakened internally. The Ummah that you pride yourself about will not be destroyed ever externally. That was something Allah had given the Rasul as a promise. Don't worry, they'll never be destroyed externally. However, the destruction will always be what? Internally. So we need to know how to fix internal struggles and not make excuses. If we can't fix Sudan, the Sudan will repeat itself somewhere else tomorrow. And we will see it again and again and again. So we have to come to terms with this issue. If we want to call ourselves an Ummah and and boast about it, we need to know how to maintain that unity, this ummatic unity. We can't say, this isn't the first rodeo. The Sudan has been this way, in previous epochs, in previous decades. So we should already know what's happening, and in fact try to prevent it from happening again. We know what the factors are. The Sudan has issues when it comes to race. Museveni last year or the year before that, well actually just last year, he went to South Sudan and he told them, you are a confused people. Of course, South Sudan is black, African, Christian, but what he meant was the Sudan, including the North, are a confused people because you consider yourselves Arabs, but you're in Africa and you're black people. So you don't have identity. You have an identity crisis here. There is a tremendous influence of ethnic tension in the Sudan. And it's not just the Sudan, because in 1994 in Rwanda, we had a similar conflict. These were the same people, the Hutu and Tutsi. And we know what happened as a result of that.
Yeah,
it's something that happens in that region, and we know it happens, right? What we should be doing is, number one, acknowledge there is a problem. Stop saying that there is no problem. Stop denying the problem. Acknowledge the problem first and foremost, and then focus on the solution. The solutions will come with the problem. But if you can't acknowledge the problem, you refuse to acknowledge the problem, you can never fix the problem you can't acknowledge. That's the problem we have. The Sudan is not being acknowledged as a legitimate problem for what it truly is. What it truly is has not been acknowledged, and we're being pulled to acknowledge it because of the tremendous, you could say, focus on it now. But in reality, it should never have escaped our sight to begin with. Never should have escaped. And for those who say, we know the external enemy over there, but we don't know it here, read your Quran. Go back to your Quran. You fix the house before you fix the garden. Fix what's inside. If you can't fix the house, you can't fix anything else. And as I said before, the Sudan, third largest when it comes to population, second largest when it comes to landmass. And it has a history of going against the Israeli and also the colonial past. They are very powerful people. They're the breadbasket of Africa. If the Sudan was fixed, by the way, when Trump was promising to relocate the people of Gaza to another land. Guess where he was promising to send them to? Guess which destination was top of the list for them to go to? Sudan. Sudan literally was the place where South Sudan, because Northern Sudan is actually in conflict. But he said, send them to South Sudan. Now, if everything was in place and working as it should be in North Sudan, even if the Palestinians didn't want to go to, there would be a safe place for them to, if they choose to go to. There is enough space, enough resource, but it's been neglected. It's been neglected for far too long. So I say this to say, yeah, we are an ummah, fair enough, but that comes with responsibilities. It comes with responsibilities. Don't just claim ummah and then turn around and say we don't know what to do in the situation. Yeah. Sorry, Doctor.
There are practical. No. What you said is bringing the ayat, Surah Hujurat, as we've done before, was what I was going to mention. And thereafter, we need to talk about what practical solutions can be done. We talk about sanctions against Western entities and such like, or speaking up and speaking truth to those who are causing oppression to the Muslim Ummah. More so, there's a lot of evidence in hadith now. More so, we need to be speaking to the leadership within our ranks with a voice that is really emphatic, that says everything that Ibrahim has mentioned and encapsulates all of that. And it needs to be a sustained effort, because at the moment, those who are interfering with the Sudan are using it as a playground, and there are no consequences for them at all from anywhere. So with that as the overarching context, where's the appetite to resolve anything in the Sudan? We've seen a genocide that's taking place. We've mentioned here on a scale that surpasses the genocide in Gaza, which is still awful, by the way. And what do we see and hear? The odd media outlet wakes up and shares news, and it stops there. Let's ask, Darfur in 2 decades ago, what was the result? Can anyone remember, unless you research deeply, what was the result and cessation of that? Where was the Ummah involvement at that time? Yes, we saw when this conflict exploded in 2023, and we saw, for example, we've seen it on the news for a while, that the British embassy wasn't helping its own British Sudanese citizens, and they were having to go to Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia was taking them in and helping them, and we've seen them on the Red Sea, shocked at the way they were being treated, and asking, why are we being treated like this? We are British. Ethnicity plays a huge part. Geographical region, being the African continent, and on the African continent, plays a huge part. And we only need to look at other countries, neighboring countries within that have particular conflicts and that are being exploited. DRC as one. The conflict that is taking place in Tigray, in Ethiopia. Where is the appetite? And I'm bringing these there because you'll see a similarity across these societies as it relates to ineptitude, lack of appetite, inaction from those nation states, Western and Eastern, that can put a cessation to this in a moment if they had the appetite and if they didn't have other nefarious interests.
Well, I think maybe we can draw it to a close there. This was a simple guide, and we've covered a great deal of detail. Absolutely fascinating, really important information here. Been a very rich conversation. I do appreciate it hugely. Maybe some final words then. What we should be looking for, what we should keep our eye on as Muslims in the West, elsewhere. Give us some sense of what we could be doing.
I'll let Ibrahim conclude with that. What I will do at this particular point in to try and incorporate what you've asked, Paul. When I saw what I saw in the camps, and when I saw the mothers who had been internally displaced and walked for days, to the extent that they could not feed their newborn children or their infants because they hadn't eaten themselves for 72 hours, 48 hours. So they had no milk, no breast milk to feed their children. I met mothers like this. I met other elderly mothers whose sons and husbands were detained by the RSF, and who were, some of them who had been killed. I saw a meal that was presented once a day. We call it in Old English gruel, that you couldn't identify what they were eating. Yet that one plate, which wouldn't feed the three of us here, was a meal once a day. If they had food, there was food poverty there. They had that for a family of 7. Some of them, the tears had dried up. But yet, looking in the children's faces, looking in the elderly's faces, there was a dignity, there's a stoicism that is there amongst the Sudanese that they are renowned for historically. And I saw that in them. And when I sat with one of them, one of the elders, and I asked him, what are you waiting for? What do you want us to do? And he said, we're just waiting for Allah to lift this from us, and we are patient with that. And I hope that me sharing this message with the viewers stokes something inside. And I'll say this, Paul, not all of us don't have the appetite. And I'll mention why. Because when I returned from Sudan, and at the end of the month, or beginning of December, I went before the congregation after Jummah, and all I said to them was, don't forget about Sudan. These are some of the things I saw. And the collection of that particular day, that particular Friday, was the largest Jummah collection in the entire year, surpassing the Jummah collections in Ramadan. And it's not because of me. That's because the people were galvanized, they were communicated with, made aware, and they have the appetite. But we need to bring this to them so that they can help. If it cannot be done at political levels, it can definitely be done at grassroots level. And the conscience of the Ummah continually be reminded of what's taking place to their brothers, their sisters, their mothers, their fathers, their children. I looked at the children there, and as you saw in one of the footages that I shared with you, I looked and said, these could be my children. That could be my auntie, my uncle, my brother. And it's not about ethnicity, it's about humanity alongside our faith.
Wow, powerful words, beautiful words. Well, thank you both very much, Ustadh Ibrahim and Dr. Abdul Haq Baker, for your time, short notice, your expertise, your clarity of thought, and your humanity is very clear. And let us not speaking to you, but let the rest of us, let us not forget Sudan. Let us keep it in our consciousness, and even if we can, to contribute in charity to support the suffering and the poor in that country, inshallah. So, yeah. So we'll leave it there. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for your time, inshallah.
Thank you.
And maybe we can come back at some future date and have an update if they're
Inshallah.
Inshallah. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having us, Paul. Thank you. Assalamu alaikum.